Okay, so this briefing video is to introduce the paracetamol experiment. So here we have the scheme of the experiment that you'll be performing. You'll be taking 4-aminophenol, reacting it with acetic anhydride, and what will happen is the amine of the aminophenol will react with the anhydride, and you're forming this amide bond here, and that will give you the structure of paracetamol, as well as acetic acid as a byproduct. And so the purpose of this experiment is to give you practice of performing synthetic chemistry and practicing these particular skills that you've performed before, but also it's going to introduce these new skills as well, which are sort of heating under reflux, which is the main way in which organic and inorganic compounds are made when you need to heat the reactions up. And also melting point analysis, which is a way of working out if you've got the correct sample and how pure it is, and NMR analysis as well. You'll be submitting an NMR sample of your paracetamol to stores, and they will run them on the school NMR machines, and you'll get your NMR spectrum back for you to analyse and work out if you've got the correct structure. NMR is probably the main technique for working out the structure of organic and inorganic compounds, and something you'll learn a lot through the theory modules on the course. And so we have skills videos showing you how to perform these techniques, so do watch them. They'll make sure that you perform these techniques correctly when you go into the lab, so then you'll be more successful with the experiments themselves. And so this is a rough plan of your experiment, how you could expect it to sort of pan out, but do read through the experiment script for the details yourself and get an idea of how long you think things will take for you. So the first part of the reaction, where you're performing the chemical reaction to make paracetamol under reflux, should take between 1 and 2 hours, and then after that you will cool your reaction down, and you should be able to isolate your paracetamol because it should sort of precipitate from the solution, and then you can simply filter it off. That will give you crude paracetamol. I've put in here a nominal lunch break for you, but you can take breaks whenever you wish throughout the day. And then you're going to purify your paracetamol by recrystallization, and then you're going to analyze your paracetamol. First, you're going to analyze the purity of the paracetamol using TLC. So with the borohydride reaction, you've used TLC to monitor a reaction. Here you're going to learn how to use it to analyze the purity at the end against your aminophenol starting material. And then you're going to also perform the other pieces of analysis as well: the melting point determination, the IR spectra, getting your IR spectra, and sort of submitting your NMR sample as well. And there should still be some extra time for you at the end of the day if you feel that you need longer to sort of perform some of these steps. So all the hazards for the chemicals that you're using are in your experiment script, so please do make sure that when you're in the lab and you're about to handle a chemical, look up the table for the chemical to make sure you know what the hazards are, what precautions you should take, and how you should dispose of it safely as well. Okay, if you get in the habit of doing that, then you will minimize the accidents that you will have in the lab. So this is a summary of the hazards of the chemicals that you're using, but this by no means sort of fully covers all the information that's in your script, so you do have to look for your script to fully understand and appreciate the hazards. But you're using sort of flammable chemicals such as acetic anhydride, ethyl acetate, petroleum ether. Some of these chemicals you're using are corrosive, such as acetic acid and acetic anhydride, so make sure you're wearing appropriate sort of protective equipment like gloves and some chemicals like the chloroform D that you're going to be using to make your NMR sample is toxic, so you need to make sure you do not breathe in any of these fumes from the chloroform D, so make sure you only handle this in a fume hood and not outside the fume hood itself. Okay, so I'll finish with some tips to help you through the experiment. The first thing relates to making sure that you set up your reflux correctly. Okay, so what you're going to be doing is you're going to be attaching a round bottom flask to a condenser, and you'll have different size flasks and different size condensers, and you need to make sure that the joints of the condenser and the flask match up so there's no gap in between the condenser and the flask, because if there is a gap, then when you're heating up the reaction, your solvent will simply boil away. Okay. The next thing you need to do is you need to make sure that you clamp around the flask and not round the condenser. Okay, so look at the picture that you have in your script and make sure you follow it correctly. This is because if you're heating your reaction and for whatever reason you need to take your reaction off the heat, you need to be able to lift your apparatus off and away from the hot plate so there's no contact with the heat source. So if you clamp around the condenser and then you sort of try and lift everything up, well, there's nothing holding the round bottom flask in place, so that will just simply fall off the bottom. Whereas if you clamp around the neck of the round bottom flask and you lift the clamp up from the round bottom flask, then everything will lift up, including the condenser. And then the other thing you need to check with your setup, and you should probably do this before you actually start heating the reaction, is you need to switch on the water of your condenser and make sure there is sort of no leaks, no water leaking onto outside of the tubing. In fact, it might be safer for you to make sure that you don't have your condenser above the hot plate. So if it does leak, it's not going to leak on the electrical equipment. Just have your condenser on the side of the hot plate. So if it does leak, you can fix and remedy it. You can either sort of change the tubing that you're using, and we've also got cable ties as well, so you can sort of make sure there's a tight grip between the condenser and the tubing itself. This next tip is a common thing that happens in the experiment. After the reflux, you cool it down, and what should happen is the paracetamol should precipitate, but sometimes the paracetamol doesn't precipitate, and what you actually need to do is just take a glass rod, which you should have in your drawer, and just scratch the inside of the flask. And what that scratching will do is it will help the precipitation to occur. Okay, so don't worry if you don't get crystals when you cool the reaction down after the reflux. If you scratch with a glass rod, you should be absolutely fine. And then finally, to do with your NMR spectrum, as I mentioned before, you're going to be submitting your NMR sample so it can be run on the NMR machines. What will happen is you'll be emailed your spectra, and so do check your emails, and that's your spectra which you need to use to analyse for your experiment submission.